in itself because very few First Nations communities are located within the city boundary. Most of them are in rural areas, but in this particular case, the entire Member 2 Reserve is located within the boundaries of the City of Sydney, the former boundaries, and indeed the current boundaries and the future boundary. How long this particular name and boundaries will last is anybody's guess in the future, because since I've been here, elected here 5 times, or 6 times, the time flies, Mr. Speaker, but 6 times, my boundary has changed, I think, 4 times. So heavens knows how that's going to react or how that's going to change in the future. But we deal with what is. And if we took in the historic parts of Sydney and Whitney Pier, we will note the historic implications of Whitney Pier. We should also note the historic implications, particularly the north end of Sydney and the Hardwood Hill area and the Shipyard area, and of course, Member 2. So if we were to start naming the riding with all the historic parts in it, we would have a riding that would look like this: Sydney, Whitney Pier, North End, Hardwood Hill, Shipyard, and Member 2. And I realize that would be, if I made a motion to amend that bill to include all those names in there, by the time you read them on the ballot, the election would be over. So I guess there's. I guess there's some, I'd like to see all of those names recognized, but certainly on the floor of this House over the years they've been recognized, all these parts of the riding of Sydney. And you're absolutely right that all of those areas of Sydney deserve recognition. And Mr. Speaker, they get that in the riding because Sydney is a historic city. It's been around for a long time. I can remember when we had the 200th anniversary of the City of Sydney, the founding of the City of Sydney. And it was at that time when I was mayor of the city that we dedicated a project to the 200th anniversary of Sydney, and it was called Centre 200, for the citizens of Sydney at the time. And it was to recognize the fact that Sydney was 200 years old, or 200 years young, I should say, and the significance of the importance of preserving that history. Also, we had a centennial year celebrations, or bicentennial year celebrations during that time, and we reacted to the landing of Governor DeBar and all the things that happened during the historic founding of Sydney, with a lot of the celebrations taking place at St. George's Anglican Church in the north end of Sydney. And at the Army base, which was known as the Garrison of Sydney at the time, Mr. Speaker. And all of those things were significant and led to the development of Sydney over the years to where it is today, a very, very cosmopolitan city, a city that's on the move, in my opinion. And it's important that we recognize where the City of Sydney came from. And I'm happy to see that the name Sydney is back on the electoral boundaries and the electoral map, and I have no difficulty with the add-on of Whitney Pier, and I would say that if we added them all on, we'd have a pretty long name. But I made that point before. But I wanted to emphasize that Sydney has many historical parts, and as I said before, one of the more significant ones, of course, was connected with the founding of Sydney, and that was the north end of Sydney. And as a son of a Sydney steelworker, my father had the opportunity over many, many years on the plant to work with the many cultural aspects of Whitney Pier, the people who came from the different countries to come to Sydney and establish in Whitney Pier. And my father made many friends from the people in that community over the years, and those were the people that certainly provided the kind of, or preserved, I should say, the kind of historical importance of those who labored hard to toil in the rough, tough conditions that were evident at Sydney Steel, particularly when it was owned by British Empire Company and the Dominion Coal and Steel Company, and finally with the government. But those people toiled long and hard and deserve to be recognized. And I want to say, Mr. Speaker, that in respect to that, there are many people who did live in the community of Whitney Pier are now living in other sections of Sydney, but they remember their roots in Whitney Pier, but we all recognize that the entire city of Sydney has a historical importance, one that's been around for a long time, and I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, that it has been a privilege of myself to represent that Sydney, no matter that particular city, Sydney, over the years, and despite the fact that I never thought that I would be representing an area that moved across the harbour, because at one time there was very little, I guess, deliverance, I guess, of one thing to another with the areas, the rural areas outside Sydney. I can recall a lot of young families moving to Westmount and Coxseat to avoid the city's bad water at the time, years and years ago, and they went over and had their own wells constructed and everything, and became less a part of Sydney than they were before that. But I can tell you that now the water system in Sydney is one of the best anywhere, because of much money spent over the past number of years to achieve that goal. And now all the people who were moved out of there, or did move out to have wells, are now wanting to connect to the city's water system, because they're having difficulties with the wells, particularly out in Cape Breton West, areas of Cape Breton West, and now soon to be known as Cape Breton Westmount, Cape Breton North Westmount, and that's a handle too, you know. And is it Cape Breton North Westmount? Cape Breton North Side Westmount, that's right. Pardon me. Let's not get the two mixed up here. But anyway, while we do have some name changes in some of the boundaries, nevertheless, all of us who live in Cape Breton, no matter what riding we live in, Mr. Speaker, are proud of where we live. I know my good friend, the member from Glace Bay, is extremely proud of his constituency, and I can recall when the previous member from Cape Breton, from Glace Bay, brought a bill to this House changing the name of Glace Bay to Glace Bay from Cape Breton East, because, you know, it encompassed only the boundaries of the former town of Glace Bay. So it was obvious that that riding should be named Glace Bay instead of Cape Breton East, because quite frankly, a lot of people didn't know where Cape Breton South began and ended. They didn't know where Cape Breton East began and ended, but they do know where Sydney is, and they do know where Glace Bay is. You know, and I commend the previous member from Glace Bay for bringing that bill to the House, and I also commend the present member from Glace Bay for keeping the problems connected with the economy in Cape Breton to the front in this House. And certainly as we move towards the next election, and if you could give me, Mr. Speaker, a hint as to when that might be, you know, I could then I could then take my place and get on with life. But anyway, I just want to end up, Mr. Speaker, by saying that on this particular bill, I'll be certainly, if we're here any longer than tomorrow, I'll be certainly back up on my feet next week to say a few words about other issues next week. But in this particular issue, I do want to say that we'll certainly be supporting this bill to rename the riding of Sydney, rename the riding of Cape Breton South, which was renamed Sydney by the Electoral Boundaries Commission, I guess. And then when it came back to this House, it's being amended to the riding of Sydney and Whitney Pier. Mr. Speaker, I probably would suggest to you that if we had all those communities in the name, it would be certainly something that I could support as well. But I recognize that the name would be extremely long, but you know, maybe if you'd indulge me, where I was born in the Gaza Strip, maybe we could name it Sydney Whitney Pier Gaza or something like that. You know, but anyway, Mr. Speaker, having said that, I can assure you that our caucus will be supporting this bill. Thank you very much.
Good job.
Thank you. If I am to recognize the Honourable Minister, it will be to close debate.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move to close debate on Bill 73.
Bill 72.
Yes, Speaker.
The
In fact, I think I
question
was
is
talking about
for
your age.
second reading of Bill number 72. Is the host ready for the question? All those in favor say aye. Those opposed? Motion is carried.
Bill number 72, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 61 of the Acts of 2012, an Act to Amend Chapter 1, 1992 Supplement of the Revised Statutes 1989, the House of Assembly Act.
Order that the bill be referred to the Committee on Law Amendments. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I think the member from Cumberland was going to make an introduction, I believe.
Okay, the Honourable Member for Cumberland North on a introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I take this opportunity to bring the House's attention to the gallery opposite. I'd like to introduce Mr. Terry Reinders, a longtime councillor of the town of Amherst and a tireless worker for his constituents, particularly with regard to the West Highlands area. I've heard of him twice or three times a week for the last 2 years about the West Highlands School, and now here he is to see us in action. Please give Mr. Councillor Reinders our best regards.
We welcome all our guests to the gallery and hope that they enjoy this afternoon's proceedings. I will now recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, could you please call Bill number 73?
Bill number 73, the House of Assembly Act. I will now recognize the Honourable Member for Guysborough Sheet Harbour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move that Bill 73 be read for a second time.
The question is for second reading of Bill number, the Honourable Member for Argyll.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I thought I'm finding this one a little odd as we go along these number of bills. I mean, we're talking about some significant changes to the names of constituencies that have been set forward by the Electoral Boundaries Commission. In this particular case, changing the East Nova or Eastern Nova Scotia to a full Guysborough Eastern Shore Tracadie. And I would think that maybe, you know, the member should speak a few moments to the changes, because from this side of the House, maybe in third reading, maybe we're lucky to hear about it, in this side of the House, it's just kind of wondering why this is happening. Who asked for the changes, or are they specifically done because the members opposite feel that that should happen that way? I would think that this is something that comes from the community to be interested in. I mean, we are going to support them as they go on, but just maybe a little history would help us all out in our process as we listen to these bills. So thank you very much. We will be supporting these bills as they go forward.
The question is for second reading of Bill number 73. Is the host ready for the question? All those in favor? Those opposed? Motion is carried.
Bill number 73, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 61 of the Acts of 2012, an Act to Amend Chapter 1, 1992 Supplement of the Revised Statutes 1989, the House of Assembly Act.
Order that the bill be referred to the Committee on Law Amendments. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, could you please call Bill 74, the House of Assembly Act?
Bill number 74. I will now recognize the Honourable Member for Colchester, Musquodoboit Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On behalf of the member for Truro Bible Hill, I move that Bill 74 be read for a second time.
The question is for second reading of Bill number 74. Is the host ready for the question? All those in favor say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried.
Bill number 74, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 61 of the Acts of 2012, an Act to Amend Chapter 1, 1992 Supplement of the Revised Statutes 1989, the House of Assembly Act.
Order that the bill be referred to the Committee on Law Amendments. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, could you please call Bill 75, the House of Assembly Act?
Bill number 75. I will now recognize the Honourable Member for Hammonds Plains, Upper Sackville.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I move second reading of Bill number 75, the House of Assembly Act.
The question is for second reading of Bill number 75. Is the host ready for the question? All those in favor say aye. Those opposed? Motion is carried.
Bill number 75, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 61 of the Acts of 2012, an Act to Amend Chapter 1, 1992 Supplement of the Revised Statutes 1989, the House of Assembly Act.
Order that the bill be referred to Committee on Law Amendments. I will now recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, could you please call government bills for second reading?
Government bills for second reading.
Mr. Speaker, could you please call Bill 67, the Elections Act?
Bill number 67, the Elections Act. I will now recognize the Honourable Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I move that Bill number 67, Amendments to the Election Act, be now read a second time.
It's Bill number 67.
Yes. 67. Yeah. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay. Mr. Speaker, it's my pleasure today to speak about this bill, which contains changes that I'm sure members of the House will be paying close attention to. As we all know, the Elections Act sets out the rules under which elections are run. It contains some of the consistencies in some areas that are unclear. These amendments will clear up those issues. Mr. Speaker, put simply, we want to make it easy as we can for parties and candidates to follow those rules. I'm sure everyone in the House can agree with that goal. I'll start by talking about how these amendments will better define election expenses. Currently, the legislation puts disabled candidates at a financial disadvantage. If they have to incur additional costs as a result of their disability, they are required to claim those as part of their allowed campaign spending. For example, a candidate in a wheelchair might have to pay to install a ramp at their campaign office or modify it slightly so that it can be reach cabinets. A blind candidate might have to have campaign literature translated into Braille. These amendments would mean that any candidate who incurs those incremental expenses would be able to hold those outside their allotted election expenses, ending that financial disadvantage. Mr. Speaker, I think that's an important amendment. It's important that we encourage more people to run for office, people who have a wealth of life experience. We must make sure that we don't inadvertently make it more difficult for someone with a disability to become a candidate. Mr. Speaker, that's not the only amendments to election expenses. Candidates will now be able to include the cost of travel outside their districts to a provincial rally or meeting, and they'll be able to claim close-out costs for a campaign office for 7 days after election. Mr. Speaker, there will also be some amendments around campaign contributions. Currently, there is no contribution limit for candidates who run independently. These amendments will set it at $5,000, the same as the contribution limit for candidates who are affiliated with a party. We are also clarifying that organizations cannot buy tickets to fundraising events where a portion of ticket price is a political donation. Currently, organizations cannot make donations to candidates or political parties, so this change will make the Act clearer and more consistent. Mr. Speaker, the Act states that individuals can give up to $5,000 to the political party of their choice in any calendar year. The Act also allows them to will up to $5,000 a year after their death. The Election Commission believes the provisions makes this difficult for the executors of an estate, since they would have to take years to pay out a bequest. So these amendments will allow anyone who chooses to support a political party in their will to do so in one lump sum rather than having to pay out an amount over a number of years. Mr. Speaker, the responsibility would then transfer over to the Electoral District Association or political party to hold that money aside, and to draw it down in annual amounts of no more than $5,000 and to report these funds and interest earned on them as part of their annual reporting requirements. But, Mr. Speaker, it's important to note that the amendments to this Act are not all about money. Amendments to this Act will ensure that the political candidates will be required to prove they have the endorsement of the party they claim to represent before they register as a candidate. Otherwise, they will be registered as an independent. Mr. Speaker, Elections Nova Scotia has told us that they have not had complaints of people misrepresenting themselves. They simply want to make sure that all candidates represent themselves honestly to the people of Nova Scotia, which I would say is a laudable goal. And I'd like to close with one very important amendment to the Elections Nova Scotia believes will help encourage the habits of voting from the first possible moment. Elections Nova Scotia has asked us to amend the Act to allow them to collect data on 16 and 17-year-olds. Currently, the Act allows Elections Nova Scotia to hold such information but does not specifically permit the agency to collect it. They plan to get this information from various public sources and directly from Nova Scotians who will be eligible to vote in the future. Mr. Speaker, they only plan to collect the basic data they keep on all registered voters. That means full names, registration address, and date of birth. When these young people turn 18 and are eligible to vote, Elections Nova Scotia will use this information to contact them and ask for their permission to add them to the voters list. No one will be added to the voters list without permission, Mr. Speaker, and political parties will not have access to their personal information until they agree to be added to the voters list. Mr. Speaker, I think it's important to note that all of these amendments have been requested by Elections Nova Scotia. I also want to point out that these amendments have the full support of all 7 members of the Election Commission, which includes representatives from all 3 political parties. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I'm pleased to rise on behalf of the Liberal caucus to say a few words on Bill 67, which is our opportunity to amend the Elections Act. The government has brought forward a number of changes and improvements that will perhaps tighten up the language and improve some of the practices during our elections. Mr. Speaker, the minister did go through those and said at the end of his introduction or moving of this act that it is the recommendations they brought have been supported by all members of the Electoral Commission, and that is very good. But Mr. Speaker, I wanted to ask the government to look again and to perhaps reply later to a memo that all of us received on it's dated April 12, 2013, and it comes from the Chief Electoral Officer from Elections Nova Scotia. And this memo actually calls for or recommends that the government make another change to the Election Act, and it's not in this Bill 67, which is before us today. And so I wanted to speak a little bit to that concern. And it's interesting to note that both the Department of Justice and the CEO of Elections Nova Scotia have recommended that this change be made to the Act. So just by way of a little background, Mr. Speaker, so that we know what it's about, it's referring to loans to registered parties, candidates, electoral district associations, and third parties, and what happens in the event of a default. And there is both the memo to all of us, to the official agents of registered parties, and also a circular which explains sort of a question and answer, which talks about what exactly is a guarantor of a loan and what happens if as stands right now, if a union or a corporation actually signs as a guarantor on those electoral loans. And it really is, I think, an oversight or certainly a problem that it's been left as is right now, Mr. Speaker. I wanted to read from that circular just so that we'll know what the electoral officer has said. It says, well, this circular provides guidance to you on how Elections Nova Scotia interprets the Election Act today. The opinion from Justice included a recommendation that the Act should be amended to provide unambiguous language, and I am recommending in my annual report that the House of Assembly review and, where necessary, redraft the relevant sections to reflect the intent of the members. Mr. Speaker, that's pretty clear, but we haven't seen the annual report yet from the Chief Electoral Officer. I believe it's expected within the week or very soon. It was to be tabled here, and so it will come soon. And I realize perhaps we've jumped the gun with these amendments that are before us in Bill 67, because there is no mention of this issue around guaranteeing of loans. And Mr. Speaker, and certainly members of the House know this, but during an election, it's very common practice to take out lines of credit or to take a loan out at a bank or financial institution in order to have funds available immediately to get going on signs and renting of office space and purchasing of printing and all the other things that are cost during an election. And Mr. Speaker, because that's common practice, sometimes there isn't money in an association and the fundraising is happening at the same time as the election has begun and is underway. And really the problem right now is that the Act as it stands will allow unions and corporate involvement in guaranteeing and in fact being involved in the financing of campaigns. And Mr. Speaker, the question then is, does that not contravene the changes that we made some years ago to ensure that unions and corporations would not be involved at all in the financing of our campaigns and our electoral system? And Mr. Speaker, so just to go through that, currently a union, corporation, or other affiliated organization would be allowed, under our current rules, to guarantee a loan for election purposes that therefore provides a financial benefit to the recipient. And the spirit of the amendments that we made in the Elections Act in 2010 was to completely prohibit union and corporate involvement in financing elections. That's it in a nutshell, Mr. Speaker. But this sort of loophole, or I should say gap, still exists. And the government has been made aware of it through this circular that came out from this memo, I guess you would call it, from the Office of the Chief Electoral Officer. And there's also on their website today a circular that answers the Q&As around this. So it's very clear to parties what is currently allowed. But the recommendation is there that we close this gap. And I would like to, and perhaps it's necessary, I should table this, Mr. Speaker. I think you'd probably like me to do so. So I'm going to table both of those. I think I've read already from one section of it. But Mr. Speaker, that to us is a shortcoming in the current bill, and I wanted to raise it today. We certainly have no objections to the amendments that have been included, but the whole purpose of doing amendments to the Elections Act is to make sure that we take our entire province to a higher plane, to a position where there can be no abuses and no, even inadvertently, that we will not rely on unions or on corporations to backstop our campaigns and to support campaigns. And the onus right now, Mr. Speaker, is on the NDP government, because the NDP government brought in the original changes in 2010, and here they are. We are today looking at Bill 67 with more amendments to the Elections Act, and we really believe that the government has been made fully aware of this loophole, and that the onus rests right now with the Minister of Justice to ensure that these changes are made. And Mr. Speaker, none of us want to see us, have anything left in the Act that can call into question the appropriateness of financing during an election. Mr. Speaker, in the last election, there was a mistake made, a mistake or a contravention of the rules by the NDP party, and they were fined for that. It was accepting $45,000 from a union donation, which was not allowed, and the NDP party was fined $10,000 and had to return the funds that they received. Mr. Speaker, that sort of thing we don't want to see, and we also don't want to see the door left open for unions to be supporting, unions or corporations, to be supporting candidates by guaranteeing their lines of credit and guaranteeing loans that they take out to run an election. Now, Mr. Speaker, people might say, well, it's not going to be, there won't be a default on those loans. And I understand that if the loan were to the party and there was a default on the loan, it really isn't a problem, because every party gets a repayment at the end based on the number of voters, and they receive the rebates for votes cast and so on. I believe it's so much per voter in the province, and the return doesn't go to the electoral district associations, the small associations on the what will be 51 electoral districts. The rebate goes to the party, and then, depending on how the party chooses to do it, they share some of that back to the individual campaigns that are run for the Liberals through the NDP to the NDP and so on. But Mr. Speaker, so that means there would be a rebate coming back or money coming back from the province. That would cover any default on a loan, and therefore it would be, even if a corporation or union signed on or guaranteed the loan, there isn't the danger that they'll ultimately pay for it, because that rebate coming from the province would cover off any such default. But the loophole really relates to local campaigns. And if a union or a corporation were to guarantee loans at the local level for individual district campaigns, there is no opportunity for a rebate directly coming back from the province of Nova Scotia to that campaign. And if in fact it were bankrupt or had no money or couldn't pay its loan back, then the guarantor would be called on to pay that loan. In that case, then, if we allow this loophole to stay in place, there's the opportunity or the possibility that a union or a corporation could actually be paying that back. Mr. Speaker, we believe that the onus is on the government to address this shortcoming. And I think it's important that I raise it today and that we talk about it in this House, because all parties have been made aware of it. I've tabled the circular from the Chief Electoral Officer. It is supported by the Department of Justice, and the Minister of Justice is well aware of that recommendation that this section of our Elections Act be amended. And Mr. Speaker, the current bill before me, while it has merit and has some good points, is not addressing this shortcoming. And I believe it is against the spirit of the original changes that were made in this House, which were sweeping changes, quite frankly. They took away years of large union donations to the NDP party, changed the way we finance our elections going forward, and I think it's very important that we listen to the Chief Electoral Officer and make the changes that have been recommended through the memo that went to all three parties. All of us have had access to that, and it has been brought up both through that circular. It's on the website, and it's been given to the minister. So, Mr. Speaker, with those few comments, I would like to just see later what the government has to say, and I just feel that it was important that we raise this shortcoming in the bill. Thank you.
Recognize the member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, I'm going to be very brief. We look forward to hearing what Nova Scotians have to say in law amendments, if anybody does come forward. And we have looked at this piece of legislation, and much of it looks like the changes are good. And it's important that this kind of legislation be continuously updated, because we know that parties that are vying for power in elections are always coming up with new ways to campaign, and it's important for legislation to keep pace with that, to ensure that when people are running for office, the conditions are fair for everyone, and that Nova Scotians have a true ability to understand what's going on, to make donations that are fair to political parties, so that we can have results in elections that we can all, even if we're not happy about them, we can all accept that they're fair. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I recognize the member for Guysborough-Sheet Harbour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to make an introduction.
Yes, indeed.
Mr. Speaker, it gives me great pleasure to introduce a couple of gentlemen up in the gallery, and fine gentlemen, and as the member for Guysborough-Sheet Harbour, this doesn't happen too often, because many of my constituents don't have the opportunity to get here to the House. So today we have Mr. Ray White, a former MLA in this House, I believe, between the years of 1993 and 1999. Ray is a very active member of the community. Certainly the Lions Club and the Seamen's Memorial are two of his passions in the community, and his work there is very much appreciated. We also have Mr. Harry Delory from the community of Canso as well, and Harry is a past King Lion, as I'm sure Mr. White is as well. And Harry does a great deal of work in the community, and is an integral part of the Lions Club and the social fabric of Canso and area. And I do want to emphasize that because it is Canso and area. So I would respectfully ask that the House extend the warmest of welcomes to those two gentlemen. And thank you, Mr. Speaker.
If I'm to recognize the Minister of Justice, it will be to close debate on Bill 67.
I just want to thank my colleagues for their comments, and I close debate on Bill 69, Statutes Amendment Act 2013.
The question for second reading of Bill 67. Is the House ready for the question? All those in favor? Those opposed? Motion is carried.
Bill number 67, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 5 of the Acts of 2011, the Elections Act.
Ordered that Bill number 67 be referred to the Committee on Law Amendments. I recognize the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, could you please call Bill 69, Statute Amendments?
I recognize the Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Amendments to Bill 69, Statutes Amendments 2013 Act. Mr. Speaker, I move that Bill number 69, amendments to the Statutes Amendments Act 2013 be now read a second time. Mr. Speaker, this bill covers a series of mainly housekeeping amendments to acts ranging from the Body Armor Act to the Motor Vehicle Act. Let's start with one of the most Nova Scotians would take note of, amendments to the Motor Vehicle Act. Mr. Speaker, the most notable amendment here, I believe, is that if Nova Scotians get into a collision that causes damage to their vehicle, they will only have to report to police if there is over $2,000 worth of damage. Right now, Mr. Speaker, it's at 1,000 damage threshold. Anyone with a car certainly knows that that cost of repairs has gone up significantly in recent years. Mr. Speaker, the Canadian Council of Motor Transport Administrators has recommended that all provinces and territories make this change to reflect those increased costs. We are also amending the Motor Vehicle Act to correct certain references to the Criminal Code. The federal government has changed some sections in recent years, and so we need to update the Motor Vehicle Act to ensure we reference the right sections. Mr. Speaker, we are also adding theft of motor vehicle to the list of criminal code offenses that automatically trigger someone's driver's license to be revoked. If someone is convicted of this offense and does not have a driver's license, they won't be able to get one. These amendments also clarify that the Register of Motor Vehicles can revoke a person's license more than once if they are convicted of any of a list of criminal offenses. To be clear, the Register of Motor Vehicles already revokes people's driver's license for more than once for these offenses. These amendments simply clarify the law to reflect current practices. I'd like to move now to amendments to the House of Assembly Act. Mr. Speaker, Elections Nova Scotia has recommended minor boundary changes in Meat Cove and in Mineville, which it believes would make elections easier to administer. These amendments change the boundaries slightly between the Dartmouth, Preston, and Eastern Shore electoral districts and between Inverness and Victoria, the Lakes. Mr. Speaker, 20 registered voters in Meat Cove will be impacted, and another 3 in Mineville General Service Area. Elections Nova Scotia has informed them about the change and has also sent letters to other homes in the area that do not have registered voters. Mr. Speaker, we are also amending the Body Armor Act. Today, professionals like police, corrections officers, security guards, and paramedics are not required to have a permit to have and use body armor. We propose to add security agents and agencies to the list of jobs that do not require a permit for body armor. This bill also contains an amendment to the Fatality Inquiries Act that will allow medical examiners authorized by the Chief Medical Examiner to issue a certificate to allow a body to be cremated or removed from the province. Currently, the Act only gives the Chief Medical Examiner the authority to issue that certificate. Mr. Speaker, medical investigators can provide the same level of oversight more quickly and more cost effectively. Alberta and Manitoba already give medical examiners this authority. Mr. Speaker, there are another 3 amendments here I would quickly like to discuss. Another amendment to the Housing Development Corporation Act will change the name of the Nova Scotia Housing Development Corporation to Housing Nova Scotia. It will also update outdated ministerial and departmental references. We are correcting drafting errors in the Personal Interest and Disclosure of Wrongdoing Act. And finally, Mr. Speaker, cadets organizations have asked that we change the date of Sea, Army, Air and Navy League Cadets Day. It will now move from the first Saturday in November to the first Saturday in October. Mr. Speaker, I appreciate this opportunity to talk about our amendments to 7 different pieces of legislation. Thank you.
Recognize the member for Inverness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I know this is an omnibus bill. There's a number of good pieces of legislation in here, and I certainly know there's value in omnibus bills because they can get a number of items through the legislature at once, and there is a place for omnibus bills. There is one piece of this legislation that has caused a lot of trouble for people in my area, and that is the people who live in Meat Cove. And I can tell you, in my electoral district of Inverness, I was not aware that the people of Meat Cove were being moved to Victoria Lakes until early January of this year. And that was well after I had voted on the legislation to change the electoral boundaries. And of course, we all voted against that legislation, but I want to say that I was not aware of the changes happening in Meat Cove. And how did I find out? Well, we were having a founding meeting. I think we had ours on January 4th, and in the lead up to that, I discovered that we were required to send some of our funds raised, that we would have raised for the next election, to the constituencies that we were giving up people to. So I knew that Port Hawkesbury was going to Richmond, and we were sending a fairly large sum from our coffers over to the Richmond, New Richmond PC Association. But I also noticed that there was a small number of voters somewhere else that were being sent to Victoria County. And I was thinking maybe these people are in the Waikagama area, because I know my boundary extends just past the community of Waikagama. So we asked the electoral office, and they said, well, actually, it's the community of Meat Cove. And I said, well, they're not going to be happy about that. And because I know in the past they had lobbied to stay in the constituency of Inverness. And so anyway, we started making some phone calls, and of course it was reported in the media. I think I had put out a release, and I mentioned that point in it, because I wanted to make people aware. It was actually my annual report that I do every year, and one of the points I made was that people in Meat Cove won't be able to vote in Inverness this coming year if we have an election. So, Mr. Speaker, I think what happened here, the Electoral Commission that was struck to decide the boundaries had to look at a lot of communities around the province. And their intent when they drew the maps was to put Meat Cove with Victoria. But when the publications were printed to show where the new boundaries were, when Meat Cove was described, it was described as going to and from Meat Cove, but never including Meat Cove. And for that reason, while it appeared on the maps that people in Meat Cove were going with Victoria, there was no clear indication that they were in writing. And that's how I missed it. And I actually went back over both reports to see, did I really miss it? And I did, and for good reason, because it really wasn't explained in the reports. And that may have been an error, Mr. Speaker, and I think it likely was. But the reason I cannot support this bill, while there are many good pieces in it, being an omnibus bill, and there's all kinds of various pieces of legislation, as the minister just described, I will not be able to support this bill because I know people in Meat Cove are upset, because they were never made aware of the changes. They never had a chance to come forward, even outside of the hearings, to even write a letter before the final decision, before the final vote was made in the legislature here. And I believe that was unfair to them. And if it was due to a mistake, that's fine to some degree. But at the end of the day, they never had a chance. They never knew what was happening. And myself, Mr. Speaker, representing the area, I never even knew it was happening. And I was certainly watching it, and nor the member from Victoria the Lakes, my colleague here, nor was he aware. And he has handed me a short note here, Mr. Speaker, about their identity, and I know they've always identified themselves with Inverness County. It's a beautiful place, Meat Cove, and they are used to working with the municipal council or the municipality of Inverness. I know I've worked with them. I know during the flooding situation a couple of years back, there was significant damage. I know I worked with the government members, the Emergency Measures Organization, and I think they've changed the name of it now, Emergency Measures Office. And I know the Minister of Transportation. At the time, we were working on making sure that the bridges were getting replaced as soon as possible. And I know I've worked on some issues in Meat Cove with respect to the moose hunt, and certainly general road conditions there, and everything from student grants over the years and projects to help out with their community center. And I know they feel upset that they're now all of a sudden going to have to move in a different direction with their concerns. And I know should the people of Victoria choose my colleague here to represent them again, I know he will do a good job and look after people in Meat Cove. And I've made the offer to them as well, Mr. Speaker. I've made the offer to them as well that whatever happens, they can always call me if I have the good fortune of being successful in the next election. And members opposite are laughing, but that's why I'm smiling. But I was sincere when I made that offer. And, but I must state, Mr. Speaker, and I will conclude, that I cannot support the legislation because I believe what happened here for people in Meat Cove, whether it was by mistake or not, and it very well appears to be, but either way, they're not happy, and I feel bad that they've been taken out of the constituents of Inverness without them even being able to know about it and to state their opinion on it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
If I am to recognize the minister, it will be to close debate on Bill 69.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish to close debate of Bill 69, Statutes Amendments 2013 Act. Thank you.
The question for second reading of Bill 69. Is the House ready for the question? All those in favor? Motion is carried.
Bill number 69, entitled An Act to Make Various Administrative Amendments to the Statutes of Nova Scotia.
Ordered that Bill number 69 be referred to the Committee on Law Amendments. I recognize the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could you please call government bills for third reading?
Bills for third reading. I recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you again, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, could you please call Bill 36, Provincial Court Act?
I recognize the Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move that Bill number 36, Amendments to the Provincial Court Act, be now read a third time. Mr. Speaker, government is required under legislation to act on the recommendations proposed by the Nova Scotia Provincial Judges' Salaries and Benefits Tribunal. That's what this bill does. As I'm sure most members of this House know, judges' salaries and benefits are set by our tribunal. This is to ensure judicial independence. Mr. Speaker, in 2010, the Public Service Superannuation Plan, to which some judges belongs, was amended to change the way pensions benefits are calculated and indexed. In July 2012, the tribunal proposed that judges keep the pension benefits they had before changes were made in 2010. The tribunal also recommended that it should be decided future pension indexing. Mr. Speaker, this independent tribunal helps to ensure that the independence of our provincial and family court judges. Tribunal members take their responsibility seriously. I respect their decision. And I'd like to take a moment to thank our provincial and family court judges for their work. They are dedicated to ensuring that the justice system in our province runs smoothly and effectively. They have a difficult job, and their work helps us to feel safe and secure in our communities. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I recognize the member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, I'm just going to speak very briefly on this piece of legislation. I just want to, I know there have been people who have, I just want to put something on the record here from a constituent. And I want to make the point, as I have in this legislature many times before, about pensions and the importance of regulation of pensions. And I know there's people in my area who have the new page pensioners, who we've certainly heard a lot about, whose hopes for retirement income were really dashed when they had to take big hits on their pensions. Yes, in part due to the state of the funds in their pensions at the time that it was that new page went into creditor protection, but also because of changes that happened with their pension based on choices they made, based on information made available to them. And that is the sticking point for me, Mr. Speaker, because I think that in some cases people were encouraged to make decisions. I don't think they really fully understood what they were being asked. And I think there's a greater role for regulation in these kind of pensions, if we're going to have them, that people know what they're voting for and understand if there's possible negative impacts down the road. And I'm not going to get into the detail of it today. We've covered it in public accounts. But I do want to raise the point again. And just because we were talking about pensions here, and we must recognize that people's pensions are different. And in the case of private sector pensions that are regulated, they need to be properly regulated. And I'll stop at that, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Question? All those in favor of Bill 36? Aye. Contrary minded? Motion is carried.
Bill number 36, an act to amend Chapter 238 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Provincial Court Act.
Ordered that the bill do pass. Ordered that the title be as read by the clerk. Ordered that the bill be engrossed. I recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, could you please call Bill number 3, Support for Parents of Critically Ill or Abducted Children's Act?
I recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move that Bill number 3, the Support of Parents of Critically Ill or Abducted Children's Act, now be read a third time and do pass.
I recognize the member for Richmond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to advise that the official opposition will certainly be giving our support to Bill number 3. Merci.
Question? All those in favor of Bill number 3? Aye. Contrary minded? The motion carried.
Bill number 3, entitled an act to amend Chapter 246 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Labour Standards Code, to support parents of critically ill or abducted children.
Order that the bill do pass. Order that the bill be as read by the clerk. Order that the bill be engrossed. I recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, could you please call Bill number 42?
I recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move that Bill number 42, the Pensions Benefit Act, be now read a third time and do pass. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I recognize the member for Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the official opposition, I'm pleased to advise that we will be in support of Bill number 42 for its final passage.
Question? All those in favor of Bill number 42? Contrary minded? Motion carried.
Bill number 42, entitled an act to amend Chapter 41 of the Acts of 2011, the Pension Benefits Act.
Ordered that the bill do pass. Ordered that the title be as read by the clerk. Ordered that the bill be engrossed. I recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, please call Bill 54.
I recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move that Bill number 54, the Widows Pension Act, be now read for a third time and do pass.
I recognize the member for Richmond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and we certainly will be supporting the official opposition, Bill number 54. And I just want to say a few words. I hadn't had the chance previously, but it was interesting to see some of the widows here in the legislature when this bill was first introduced. And when I heard the name Betty Bauman, I was thinking, why do I know that name? And I recall, Speaker, I believe you indicated that yourself when you were speaking many, many years ago, receiving correspondence and receiving presentations from both Mrs. Bauman and many other widows as well. And so they have certainly kept at this and kept up the fight, and obviously it has paid off for them, and we certainly are pleased to see that. But I'd be remiss, Speaker, at law amendments. We did have some presentations from the Pictou County Injured Workers Association that did raise some concerns as to how this transpired, and the fact that I believe there's a committee formed that does receive advance notice when changes are going to be made. No notice was given in this case, which they found to be a bit bizarre. And again, they highlighted a number of issues which still do exist in the workers' compensation system, which I'm sure both the Deputy Premier and all government members are aware of. One of the issues that I raised as well, based on concerns brought to me by a constituent, was the federal government's decision to move the old age security from 65 to 67. Many of the benefits that are made available to injured workers under the workers' compensation benefit system terminate at the age of 65 because they were tied in with receipt of old age benefits. The question that was raised to me is what happens now between the age of 65 and 67 if the federal government proceeds with that change, which is down the road, but still, I had the constituent who actually contacted me is permanently disabled and will actually be affected by this change. He's at an age where he's calculated that he will not be in receipt of old age until 67 based on the proposed changes. So it's an issue which I haven't heard much from the government on. I know it is down the road, but there's obviously going to be a cost incurred by making, if a change is made here, and if not, what do we do with these injured workers from the age of 65 to 67? Because as we all know, benefits under community services terminate at 65. So really, if someone is cut off of their workers' compensation benefits, there is nowhere else for them to turn to at 65 because there are no other government programs currently that would be able to assist with monthly benefits to replace the earnings that they have lost. So anyways, Mr. Speaker, I raised that. I'm sure it's not the first time the government's heard of it. Hopefully we will get some indication as to whether it's a matter of discussion or whether there is some sort of a plan that's being put in place to deal with that matter when it does come up. But as far as the widows, obviously we're pleased to see that a historical wrong has been righted, and I want to commend all of them for their continued advocacy to all members of the legislature over a very long period of time. Merci.
Recognize the member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, this legislation is a good piece of legislation. And I know that it helps widows whose husbands have passed away from the Spring Hill Mines disaster, the fishermen around the province who have died on the job, the paper mill in Point Tupper in the area it's in Richmond, but in an area that's very close to where I represent, and the Glace Bay mining explosion of, I believe it was 1979. So, Mr. Speaker, this is a matter that I've had discussions with the minister on, and I'm happy to see him bring it forward. I commend him for that. I do know that what this legislation is about is really many women who, the women who have been affected by it, the situation they were put in was it was assumed because they remarried that another man would look after them, in a sense. And we all know that that's very sexist, to put it bluntly. But that was the thinking, I guess, at the time. And it's good to see that government can find ways to make things right that were once wrong. So we do know that an amendment was passed to fix the issue, starting from 1999 forward. But this piece of legislation fixes the issue from 1985 to 1999, that period that had not been addressed. We do know the period before 1985 can't be addressed because that is before the, I believe it was Section 15 in the equality provision in the Charter came into force. So, Mr. Speaker, many of these widows suffer the loss of their spouses well before 1985, and for many years, up until now, have been dealing with the period from 85 to 99, and it's good to see that that's being addressed. So I'm happy to see the legislation come forward. I think it's the right thing to do, and I do know that there's a cost, Mr. Speaker, but I do feel that in the grand scheme of things, it's the right thing to do, and it's a reasonable approach to make it happen. And I know that it's going to be there for the widows who are still living, and I think that's a good thing. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. If I'm to recognize the minister, it will be to close debate. The Honourable, the Government House Leader.
Yes, so just a few words. I thank the members for the intervention. The member from Richmond brought up a good point about people being in no person's land, if you will, in the future if they're caught in a period between 65 and 67. But I would be remiss if I didn't say that that there was a time when we used the clinical rating system, Mr. Speaker, and it allowed all members, if you're in receipt of a WCB pension, that you could carry with you for life. And it was the last Liberal government that changed that. That went to wage loss, and that the pension stopped at 65. It's something that concerns us, though, Mr. Speaker, and it concerns us from that perspective, and it concerns us, I'm sure at some point, no matter who's in government here, Mr. Speaker, that there will be a challenge, I think, at some point about why are we using 65 if we don't have mandatory retirement, and that will become another issue of going from wage loss in the clinical rating system. But you know, I hear what the member says. It's on our desk, and we're looking at it, and we're trying to make sure that nobody in the transition period is hurt. So, Mr. Speaker, with those few words, I take my place and I move third reading.
The motion before the House is third reading on Bill number 54, the Widows Pension Act. Is the House ready for the question? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? The motion is carried.
Bill number 54, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 10 of the Acts of 1994-95, the Workers' Compensation Act, to extend pension entitlement to more workers' widows.
Order that the bill do pass. Order that the title be as read by the clerk. Order that the bill be engrossed. The Honourable, the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, would you please call Bill 57?
Bill number 57, the Language Schools Act. The Honourable, the Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you. It's a pleasure, Mr. Speaker, as always. Speaker, I move that Bill number 57, the Language Schools Act, now be now read for a third time and do pass.
Now recognize the Honourable, the Member for Richmond.
Speaker, I'm pleased to advise that the official opposition will very happily be giving their support to third reading of Bill 57, the Language Schools Act.
If I recognize the minister, it will be to close debate. Question has been called for third reading of Bill number 57, the Language Schools Act. All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? The motion is carried.
Bill number 57, entitled An Act Respecting Language Schools for International Students.
Order that the bill do pass. Order that the title be as read by the clerk. Order that the bill be engrossed. The Honourable, the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could you please call Bill number 32?
Bill number 32. The Honourable, the Government House Leader.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I call this bill on behalf of the Minister of Service, Nova Scotia Municipal Relations. So I move now that Bill number 32, the Solemnization of Marriage Act, be now read a third time and do pass.
The Honourable, the Member for Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to advise that the Liberal caucus, the official opposition, will gladly be giving our support to third reading of Bill number 32.
If I recognize the Minister, it will be to close debate. The Honourable, the question has been called. The question is for third reading of Bill number 32. Is the host ready for the question? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Against? The motion is carried.
Bill number 32, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 436 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Solemnization of Marriage Act.
Order that the bill do pass. Order that the title be as read by the clerk. Order that the bill be engrossed. The Honourable, the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, could you please call Bill 37, the Innovative Transportation Act?
Bill number 37, the Innovation Transportation Act. The Honourable, the Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move third reading of Bill number 37, the Innovative Transportation Act 2013. Thank you.
If I recognize the Minister, it will be to close debate. The Honourable, the Member for Richmond.
Speaker, as well, I'm pleased to advise that the official opposition Liberal caucus will be giving our support to the passage of Bill number 37, the Innovative Transportation Act.
The Honourable, the Member for Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I too stand today on behalf of our caucus to show our support for this bill. Rather interesting one, some alternative options that may come about. We have seen in the town of Windsor in recent days a Segway traveling around there. People are obviously interested in some Segways, and God only knows what else might come along in the future too, I guess, as we think about it. But just to take a moment to say that we do support that and whatever other opportunity might exist within the current bill. Thank you.
Thank you. Question has been called. All those in favour of Bill number 37, the Innovation Transportation Act, signify by saying aye. Against? The motion is carried.
Bill number 37, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 293 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Motor Vehicle Act, respecting innovative transportation.
Order that the bill do pass. Order that the title be as read by the clerk. Order that the bill be engrossed. The Honourable, the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could you, would ask now, you now leave the chair, and the House resolves itself and the whole House on bills.
We will take a short recess. Order, please. The Committee on whole host on bills will now come to order. The Honourable the Government House Leader.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, would you please call Bill 51, the Financial Measures Act 2013.
Bill number 51, the Financial Measures Act 2013. I recognize the clerk.
Mr. Chair, Bill 51 came back from the Law Amendments Committee without amendment, and there are 26 clauses.
Shall Clause 1 carry? The Honourable the Member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And we had passed out some amendments to this, but I'm told that we cannot delete any items. These were the change sheets that came from law amendments. But I'd like to speak against the first clause. And on a number of others, the members have before them the other clauses as well. It would be change sheet number 2 that you'd receive from the Liberals. And on all of those, the clauses relate to fees and the fees that had to be included in legislation in order to be raised. We know that early, or I guess at the very end of March, when the House had just begun to sit, we were presented with 1,400 roughly fees that have been increased for the province of Nova Scotia. And the Liberal Party is wanting to remind all members that fees should not be confused with taxes, and that there has to be a justification that the fee increase is actually justified to recover the costs of providing a service. That's what the difference is between a fee and a tax. A tax can just arbitrarily be raised. So Mr. Chair, the point of bringing this forward is to signal our disagreement with having these fees in the Financial Measures Act, and again to remind the government that when they sat in opposition, they spoke loudly against such fee increases, and the Premier of the province today in opposition said that these were tax grabs. When it's not justified, when there's no explanation for what the fee increase is all about and what costs are incurred to deliver a service, then that becomes essentially a tax increase. And so as part of the Financial Measures Act, a number of the fee increases that the government introduced are incorporated here, and we've indicated them on the sheet, but certainly page 1, part 1 is the first one of those. And there are many other fees that were passed out which don't even appear in the FMA, this Financial Measures Act, because they could be done by regulation. And as I said, a long list of those that we also, believe were not properly explained or justified, and therefore may not be at all really in keeping with the fact that it's a fee. In the first place, it really looks like tax grabs. And I remind the government that the NDP were opposed to this practice when they were in opposition, and that we believe that there should be justification for each and every fee increases. Thank you very much. So we won't be supporting this first clause. Thank you.
Thank you. Shall Clause 1 carry? Carried. Clause 2. Shall Clause 2 carry? Carried. Clause 3 carry. The Honourable the Member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. There are a number of these, and maybe it'd be helpful if I just lay them out, the ones that we don't agree with, because you're doing it by clause. We've got pages 2 and 3, part 3, that is exactly the same explanation. It's fee related. And if I can jump ahead, I don't know if I'm allowed to. Am I allowed to, Mr. Okay, well then you have in front of you where they are. So perhaps you'll just signal me and we'll get up, because some of the clauses we're okay with. We'll let some of them go by. So but I want the members to know that these are all related to fee increases that are my cause. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Shall Clause 3 carry? Carried. Shall Clause 4 carry? Carried. Shall Clause 5 carry? Carried. Shall Clause 6 carry? Carried. Shall Clause 7 carry? Shall Clause carried? Shall Clause 8 no, Clause 7? Clause 8. Shall Clause 8 carry? And the Honourable the Member for Halifax Clayton Park.
I believe, is that subclause 8, 1 and 2? That's where we're at. 8, 1 and 2 is a different change that the Liberal caucus objects to, and that relates to the small business threshold. A change that was incorporated in the budget this year is a two-parter. One part was to lower the small business tax rate to I guess, 3.5%. And at the same time, there was a change to change the threshold. That is the amount of income at which a small business is no longer seen as a small business but becomes a corporation. The difference for a business is 3.5% tax or 16% tax. And in Nova Scotia, we were previously tied for the lowest threshold in the country with another province at $400,000. That was the point at which a small business would kick into the corporate tax category. Now we've done something that's very regressive. We've moved that threshold down to $350,000. That change is included right here in subclause 8, 1 and 2, or clause 8, subclauses 1 and 2. That is what actually brings that into effect. That's going to have a detrimental effect to small business. It punishes those small businesses that are striving to do better and making more income. It throws them into the corporate tax bracket much sooner than they would otherwise have been. And it gives us the dubious distinction of having the absolute lowest threshold. And in this case, lowest threshold is not a good thing. It is a negative factor for small business to be in that category. Other provinces allow businesses to earn more before they're hit with the much higher corporate tax rate. For that reason, we strongly oppose these two clauses. And Mr. Speaker, or Mr. Chair, at the same time, there is an amendment which applies in this case, and it is subclause 8.3. There's an amendment there I would like to move, and that is that. Is that fine? And it is on the change sheets for other members to look at, but it's on page 4, subclause 8.3, and it is to renumber as clause 8. And the second part of that is that line 1, we add, quote, of the revised statutes 1989, the Income Tax Act, after, quote, 217. So if you look at the bill, you can see where that fits in. What we're trying to do with this amendment is to reverse the change in the small business threshold and leave it at 400,000, where we are tied, for lowest place in the province or in the country. Thank you.
Thank you. There has been an amendment. Is the host ready for the question? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Nay. The motion is defeated. Shall clause 8 carry? Shall clause 9 to 13 carry? No. Not. Carried. Clause number 14. Clauses now 14 to 21. Carried. Carried. Clauses 22 to 25. Carried. Clause is carried. Clause number 26. Carried. Clause 26 is carried. Shall the title carry? Carried. Shall the bill carry? Carried. The Honourable, the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I wish the committee to now rise and report progress.
We will take a short recess. Order, please. The chair of the Committee on the Whole House and Supply reports.
The Committee of the Whole House on Bills has met and considered the following bill, Bill 51 without amendments, and the chairman has been instructed to recommend this bill to the favorable consideration of the House.
Carried. The Honourable, the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, with the indulgence of the House, could we revert back to orders of the day, presenting reports of committees?
Is it agreed? Agreed. Presenting reports of the committees. The Honourable, the member for Halifax Atlantic.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as chairman of the Committee on Private and Local Bills, I'm directed to report the committee has met and considered the following bill, to number 43, an act to amend Chapter 197 of the Acts of 1901, an act to incorporate the trustees of the Onslow Cemetery Company. Committee recommends this bill to the favorable committee of the House and without amendment. There you go.
No, just no good. Agreed. Carried. The Honourable, the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Due to your judicious way of holding proceedings, that concludes our government's business for today, Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I wish the House to now rise to meet from the hours of 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. tomorrow. And after the daily routine, Mr. Speaker, we'll be doing bills for third reading, bill number 51, bills for second reading, bill 76, private members bill 77, and private local bills in committee of the whole, bill number 43. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I ask the House to now rise to meet from the hours of 9 a.m. to 3 p.m.
The motion before the House is that we now do rise and meet tomorrow at the hours of 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. Is the House ready for the question? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Against? The motion is carried. We are now adjourned till 9 a.m. tomorrow morning. We have now reached the moment of interruption. Today's late debate under Rule 5, therefore be resolved, since the Premier stated in a CTV panel that the power rate Nova Scotians will pay is 8 cents per kilowatt hour, despite Emira saying no rate will be decided until 2017, that the NDP should introduce legislation that forces Nova Scotia Power and not the ratepayers to be responsible for any costs above 8 cents. I recognize now the honourable member for Dartmouth North.
Dartmouth East.
Dartmouth East, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to rise on this today. You know, the advantage to the intervening couple hours is we've actually been able to speak to Emira and also review this, the misrepresentation that the inadvertent misrepresentation, I suspect, that the Premier made about Emira's comments in this article, and I'll be able to go through that having spoken or having looked into that. I mean, you know, Mr. Speaker, as the House will be aware, yesterday, I believe the panel was probably recorded a few days earlier, but yesterday CTV aired an Atlantic Premier's panel, and the Premier is concerned that I didn't quote his entire quote, so I'll do his entire quote here. I saw what Emira predicted. They said the blended price for kilowatt hour would be somewhere in the vicinity of 8 cents a kilowatt hour. So it's a pretty significant savings over what we would see today. And that was the entirety of his statement in response to that question. And I tabled that earlier, and I'll table another copy shortly, but I'm going to continue to quote it. You know, Mr. Speaker, when asked in question period today, the Premier referred to a January 26, 2013 Herald article saying that that's what they said. But in fact, that's not actually at all what they said. It talks about here, in fact, it's not even a quote from Emira. They'd say that the price of $1.5 billion, which obviously doesn't include the interest, the rate of return, or anything else, that's the base price, works out to 8 cents a kilowatt hour. And that's based on the 2017 energy price forecast and assumes Nova Scotia Power is getting 1/3 of its electricity from Labrador or other imports. couple problems, Mr. Speaker. First of all, in the filing that happened on February 28th, a little over 2 months after this, Emera will only be taking 8% of their energy. Maybe that's where he's getting the 8s confused, but will only be actually taking 8% of their energy from the Muskrat Falls project. That's all they're contracted for, 8% of the approximate load to a maximum of 10% potentially. They will not be taking 30%, and in fact, in IR's filed, they have no contract for any amount of energy beyond that. So right away, that number is irrelevant because this number is based on more than 3 times the amount of energy that actually Emera, in their filing 2 months after this article, has agreed to. So it may, and I'm not even sure, because, but it may have actually been 8 cents when it was a 30% mark. But it's not a 30% mark now. It's 8 to 10% in the filing. Second of all, when you read the documents that Emera filed, again, I tabled earlier today, unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, don't have an additional copy, it says that the final rate will be determined in 2017. So that's fine. And you know, I appreciate the fact that the Premier believes that it'll be 8 cents a kilowatt hour blended. And frankly, if it's 8 cents a kilowatt hour, that is wonderful, because we're paying, I believe the residential rate is 13.47 cents, but it's 13 point something anyways. I mean, that would be wonderful, Mr. Speaker, but you know what? That's not what Emera is saying. Emera and Mr. Huskelson and so forth are saying we can expect the rate to be actually higher than what it is now. In fact, a 1% increase per year in each of the 35 years on average. There'll be some years a bit more, some years a bit less, that's fine, but that's an average. And I don't know what the compounded interest on that, Mr. Speaker, is, but that is going up, not going down. There would actually have to be about a 60% decrease. So here's the issue. The feeling is, Mr. Speaker, and I don't think this is a terribly unreasonable request, the Premier, a few months back, I don't remember the exact time, made an agreement with Emera that he would do nothing to change the regulatory environment that would result in Emera having a loss as a result of regulatory changes. Fine, he felt that was important. I believe that was then structured into the federal loan guarantee. What we're saying is if the Premier wants to go on television and tell the public it will be 8 cents, even though Emera says it will not, then legislate, give the same guarantee to Nova Scotians. I don't really think that's too much to ask. The Premier says he believes it, and that's what he's staking his credibility on. Then legislate it. He's got nothing to lose, Mr. Speaker. And when if it comes out at 8% or 8 cents, which I don't think there's anybody in the province other than the Premier believes, then he'll be able to say, see, I was right. And that's great. He's got nothing to lose in introducing legislation and giving ratepayers a guarantee. And the only reason you wouldn't do it is if you don't actually believe that that number is achievable. Mr. Speaker, and this really comes to the crux of the issue. This isn't about whether there are strategic benefits to having a maritime link or Muskrat Falls or even Gull Island when that comes next down the pipe. It's not about that. There are strategic advantages on a lot of different things. There are strategic advantages in upgrading the link between the intertie between Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, which the Premier committed to do, I believe, in his very first year in office and still hasn't happened. There are strategic opportunities in a lot of projects. But just because there is a strategic opportunity doesn't mean that a deal is the best deal for ratepayers. And in fact, one of the experts who was hired by the board, I believe it was Leviton, noted that, you know what, there could be a lot of benefits in the Muskrat Falls, but said this deal is actually not the best option for ratepayers and that a new deal should be structured. So it's not about whether the project has potential. The issue is whether the deal is structured benefits ratepayers, and the evidence is stacking up that it doesn't. But if it's 8 cents, then listen, I'm right there. If it's 8 cents and the Premier will guarantee that ratepayers will pay 8 cents a kilowatt hour rather than the 13 and some odd they're paying now, and the over 14 they'll pay after the coming rate increases factor in, well, that's fine. Then you know what? That's great. And the coming ones, when we talk about the coming rate increases, we saw recently that there were underestimates in fuel costs and so forth, which are getting backed up. And that is backing up into an account that ratepayers will be responsible at the end of the current stability agreement. So, Mr. Speaker, at the end of the day, if the Premier truly believes that this project, when blended in with wind and hydro and gas and whatever coal is left in the system at that time, and whatever the hydro we have down in the Mersey River and up in Wreck Cove, if he believes that when all that's combined in, ratepayers will open their bill and go 8 cents a kilowatt hour, then I'm okay with that 8 cents for the 35 years. But I want the Premier to put his credibility on the line with that and legislate it and give ratepayers the guarantee that he has given to Emera. He's got, from my perspective, he stands up and says that's what it's going to be and he believes it, then he's got nothing to lose. He's got absolutely nothing to lose because he's saying that's what it is, and he's saying that Emera is on board with it, despite the fact that Emera in their filings say they're not, but that's okay, he says they are. So, Mr. Speaker, this is about having the right and accurate information for Nova Scotians about this project. It's why we, among many, many others, have lobbied to have more time for the hearings and have that timeline set by the board as an independent third party. It's why we've said all of that information should come through. And the Premier's statements around an 8-cent rate are no different, Mr. Speaker, than the fact that the Premier stands up and says it's the lowest and fairest cost, but won't actually give the board, the consumer advocate, small business advocate, the time to actually assess that question and determine whether the evidence actually backs that up. And the only conclusion that you can come to at the end of that is that the Premier won't even stand behind the things that he's saying. And I think that it's important that he does. If he's going to give those kind of commitments to Nova Scotians, if he's going to make a promise of 8 cents, if he's going to make a promise that it's going to be the lowest and cheapest alternative, then allow that to be tested. Don't be scared of having that tested. Because if you believe it, then you're willing to stand up to the scrutiny. You're willing to put your name behind it and your credibility. So, Mr. Speaker, at the end of the day, I think there's a lot of Nova Scotians that would hope that it would be 8 cents. And frankly, at the end of the day, the Premier has the opportunity to legislate that and prove it.
Thank you. We'll now recognize the Honourable, the member from Cumberland North.
Oh, we're going third.
Oh, so, my mistake, sorry. The Honourable, the member for Hants West.
There's the lights on. What's that? Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and pleased to take a few minutes this evening to join in a debate, one that's been had multiple times in this House and probably will for some time ahead, given the opportunity in the weeks and the months and who knows years ahead while this project unfolds in some particular fashion. It's interesting that we have a resolution before us that's talking about 8 cents given the current price we're paying and given the fact that Nova Scotians just saw in January a 3% increase and guaranteed another 3% increase in their rates come January 14. So it would be interesting to ever see us at 8 cents. That would be a nice rebate, if you will. Or the direction would be going the right way anyway. The rate would be going the right way if we could ever get back to 8 cents. I think people would be quite pleased to be paying that compared to what they're paying now. And not only individual households, as I've done many times, I've referred to the business community, who is also one of their biggest expenses is their power rates that they're paying. Certainly the middle-sized businesses and even the small business for that matter. It's still a regular occurring monthly bill that comes in, and every time that goes up, it's more money out of their pockets. And with the economy the way it's been, and it's been less money coming in the door. So it's been making it very difficult for businesses and families in this province to survive when we see ongoing increases in the rate structure. Now, if there were some way of getting it back, that would be wonderful, as I've said. But it's interesting, this is the first time we've heard a figure of 8 cents. One of the things I've asked for many times in this legislature when talking about energy and Nova Scotia Power and Newfoundland and the deal that may happen at Muskrat Falls or may not, where most are assuming it will, or some are still under the impression that it may never, given the ever-rising cost. But one of the things that people would like to know is actually what will the cost be. And we've asked many times where where will that come from? What will that cost exactly be? Or even could we get a close estimation of what it might be? We've never been able to get that. So I wonder if there seems like there's a lot more to this, and perhaps when the honourable member from the government side gets up to speak, he'll enlighten us all and that this was maybe taken out of context or something like that. But I can tell you, if the Premier's going to stand before Nova Scotia and say that we expect 8 cents per kilowatt hour, I don't know that you need to legislate it or not, but I think that Nova Scotians would be, as I said, quite happy. But I just can't see that given the situation we have in this province, where Emera and Nova Scotia Power have a base that they need to support, shall we call it, by way of the guaranteed income that they have to their shareholders. I can't imagine that ever that those shareholders want to see those rates go down. That's less money into their pockets. Now, perhaps there's some other scheme here that would make all of that work. And, you know, perhaps, again, when the honourable member gets on his feet from the government side, he could explain more in detail what this really means. So we certainly will look forward to hearing what that means. And I doubt very much there'll ever be legislation that will be introduced in this House that will force Nova Scotia Power to pay any cost overruns, because they've been clear on that piece all the way along. They have made it very clear that any cost overruns that occur to them will be borne by the ratepayer. They've made that very clear, especially pertaining to the project with Newfoundland. Now, maybe the Newfoundland project, in the end of the day, does not go ahead. We know that there is a review coming up, although we would have liked to have had more time, but there have been a number of reports put forward to say that perhaps this isn't the right deal, and I've tabled those in question period this week, and so have others for that matter when we spoke to this very issue, that maybe it's not the most cost-effective deal for Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. So we have to try to figure out what is the right deal and whether we can afford it or not. Now, 8 cents would lead Nova Scotians to believe today, if that's what's being proposed, that's probably a pretty good deal if we could buy energy for 8 cents. We could buy energy for anywhere for 8 cents and retail it to the customers. That would be great. And there's been multiple ideas put forward as to how that could happen as well. And we all have a bit of a difference of opinion when it comes to how we could create an energy market that would be best to serve Nova Scotians by way of where we would purchase and how much. And I mean, it's measured right now, we know, by the hour, by every 10 minutes, I think it's captured what the costs are and how much energy is being used and such. So we have to look at all the alternatives. But to say that that 8 cents is a possible alternative is a very good alternative from what we hear from Nova Scotia Power. We know that the 35-year deal, people are very concerned about that. A lot changes in 35 years. We know that Newfoundland was not happy in the end of the day when they signed a very long-term deal. They did not feel that they were treated fairly with the cheap electricity going into Quebec. Perhaps there's another way to write that if they felt they were wrong. Maybe they should look at another deal, and perhaps they should. I'm stating that maybe they should. Perhaps they've looked at all that by way of other opportunities to still sell power to the province of Quebec in a new deal. And I'm sure when this one runs out, the 50-year deal runs out between Quebec Hydro and Newfoundland, there'll be some interesting exchanges take place there as far as what could happen with potential sales of power and rerouting it. Because, let's face it, Quebec is still going to need to have power regardless of contract or not when that expires. So I'm sure they'll be working toward trying to renew that. And they're getting it relatively cheap. We do know that. But 8 cents seems a bit unreasonable. It's been a long time since we've been at 8 cents in Nova Scotia. I can't tell you the exact date, but I know it's been quite a while. We've seen energy costs in this province go up by over 30% just in 4 years. We're going to see again, as I said, 3% more is guaranteed already for January of 2014. So I would suggest if there is a plan, if there's something else that is out there, if there is a way that we're going to get to 8 cents, then people should come clean on this. They should be very clear as to what this exactly means and tell all Nova Scotians. We've been asking long enough on their behalf, what will the cost be? And if it's not 8 cents, if that was misconstrued by some people or others or misunderstood, whatever the right terminology is you'd like to use, and I'm sure, again, I'll state that when the honourable member gets up from the government side and tries to clarify, and I'm sure that will be the intent, as has been written for him, this issue of the 8 cents, obviously they're talking about cost. Somebody knows something more about what the cost will be, the reality, the real cost moving forward. We should lay that rate out here today on the table, Mr. Speaker, and tell Nova Scotians all across this province, every ratepayer, business sector, small business sector, everyday homeowners who are paying for these high energy costs, what that will mean. And with those few words, Mr. Speaker, my time I'm sure is just about up. I'll take my seat.
Thank you. We'll now recognize the honourable member from Cumberland North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is my pleasure to stand in my place today and respond to this request for late debate on the Maritime Link. And I'm pleased that such rich discussion will bring forward more research and analysis. There seems to me at this moment to be a couple or three things in particular that we're speaking of. We're speaking of renewable, clean, green energy. We're speaking of power rates, and we're speaking of an 8%, a number of an 8%, or no, sorry, 8 cents per kilowatt hour. Just for starters, a short time ago in the Halifax Herald, there was a front page article that listed 3 different jurisdictions in the province of, or in Canada, 3 different provinces, and did itemize Nova Scotia as among the highest, or the highest of those 3. The lowest of those was for the province of Manitoba. And that article also acknowledged that the province of Manitoba, with the lowest industry or lowest electricity rates in Canada and North America for that matter, if I recall the article correctly, and I think that I do, and that is because Manitoba Hydro 30 years ago did have the forethought to proceed full bore with hydroelectric power. I hear no dispute from anybody on that. The other jurisdiction had twice as much, or was halfway between Manitoba rates and Nova Scotia rates, and it had twice as much hydroelectric power that the province of Nova Scotia has currently. It is, to my mind, to my thinking at the moment, indisputable that hydroelectric power is in this country the most economical, cleanest, greenest, dependable form of energy that we have in the country today, the best technology that there is. Currently, a number of highly qualified experts are preparing responses to the intervener. Questions and their input will add further understanding of the analysis of the Maritime Link. The experts' answers will be filed and available to interveners on May 8th, according to the URB schedule. The process being undertaken by the UARB is progressing as planned and as it was meant to. Many files of sophisticated evidence have been presented, evidence that compares the Maritime Link to all other options. The UARB has comprehensive materials on all options, including the Maritime Link, and is investigating all these evidence thoroughly. Now, whichever way you slice it, if we assume that hydroelectric power is the most efficient, cleanest, greenest, dependable, and cheapest, as evidenced by the Manitoba example, and we'd also know that Hydro-Quebec, by virtue of having built the hydroelectric power stations in Labrador, is one of the more profitable companies in North America as a consequence of that, to the chagrin of many Newfoundlanders, I understand. If that is also considered to be general knowledge, we have the opportunity, we have the good fortune to be able to buy in to 20% of the next great hydroelectric power project in North America. Why would anybody not want to do that if we had an opportunity? Now, in general, rates are rising by an average of 2 or 3% a year. 1 or 2% is due to the cost of adding more renewable energy. Now, this province has mandated that 25% of its power supply come from renewable sources by 2015, increasing to 40% by 2020. In addition, Ottawa introduced new greenhouse gas emission limits last year that will require Nova Scotia to scale back coal-fired generation by 2030. Now, in comparison, like residential customers today do pay 13.79% per kilowatt hour. including fuel costs. And yes, I do acknowledge, much to our collective disappointment, that power rates have increased by considerable measure. Power rates have increased as a direct consequence, Mr. Speaker, of the increase in the price of coal. How long do Nova Scotians expect us to be tied to the price of coal? Fluctuate as it will, we have no influence, we have no input on what price Nova Scotia Power pays for that fuel. We do, however, have input, we have influence in how much we will pay for clean, green, dependable, renewable energy from the Maritime Link. Now, when we get, let's just touch on the 8 cents per kilowatt hour. I don't know exactly what the context was of the interview, or how it came across, or how it was interpreted by many of the people that heard it. But as an energy price, the $1.5 billion works out to 8 cents per kilowatt hour. Now that's the blended rate. That's what Emira said. That's based on 2017 energy price forecasts, and assumes that Nova Scotia Power is getting 1/3 of its electricity from Labrador or other inputs. Now, the opposition mentioned the difference between 10% and 20% and 30%. Well, those are all valid figures taken in context. Nova Scotia, through the Maritime Link, is purchasing 20% equity in power getting from Emira. 20% equity. That amount of power, which we will own by virtue of purchasing it, by taking part in the Maritime Link, will supply Nova Scotia with 10% of its power needs. We own that 10% of the power. In addition to that, Mr. Speaker, the loop will be closed, and there will be power sent through the Maritime Link, through Nova Scotia, through New Brunswick, to American markets. A whole lot more power will be passing through those lines on the way to the United States, through Nova Scotia, through New Brunswick. We will have access to that power as well. When the time comes, when the necessity comes, we will have access to as much of that power as we might need, and that could in effect work out to, and likely, as a matter of fact, will work out to 30% of Nova Scotia power needs. So the 10% is explainable, the 20% is explainable, and a 30% is explainable. As a matter of fact, not only explainable, but quite obvious to my way of thinking, to anyone that's actually had a look at the project and look at the numbers are. Mr. Speaker, it is important to acknowledge that with a range of experts submitting their evidence on the Maritime Link proposal for consideration, there is no evidence that is considered absolutely indisputable. Many experts support the project, some do not. And experts on both sides have information they want to share. However, the important detail to remember is that the UARB will have a chance to review all the information and make its decision. That is why there is an objective review process, Mr. Speaker. As part of this detailed analysis, the UARB will review the cost of all options as part of an objective, transparent process. It will determine whether the Maritime Link is the best option for ratepayers. And as I said earlier, we are pleased that it is unfolding as it should. Mr. Speaker, in 25 years from now, people will be looking back at 2013, at the dialogue we had regarding the Maritime Link, that we should or shouldn't proceed with it, and they will be saying to themselves, my gosh, what were they thinking? Of course they should have done it. It's the best thing could be done at the time, and I'm proud to be part of the government that brought in that legacy. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. I want to thank all members for their participation in tonight's debate. We have now finished the late night debate. We are adjourned until 9 a.m. tomorrow morning. We are now adjourned.